afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Propagandacast Addendum. After the US Army review, we now want to look at the Oberkommando West. My thoughts, my sort of ideas on it. You know, how do I think this army actually works? Is it worth it to actually get at the moment? You know, worth it to play it? And you know, what sort of metagame might we expect? Basically, sort of the same thing as the United States Army. And you might sort of ask, you know, up front, well, what are sort of your general thoughts on it? Could you sort of elaborate or get sort of a general idea of that before you go into it? You know, the thing is, sort of groundwork-wise, there's some lots of neat ideas. Mechanically, it's also really interesting. There's some good ideas in there. The problem is, in terms of execution, it runs into a series of problems which largely come down to a lot of the units themselves not working very well within the overall mechanics of the army provided. And that overall leads to an army which overall in comparison to the other armies is a lot more limited, is a lot less viable, runs a larger risk of basically not being very fun in the long run, because once the novelty effect wears off, then you're really left with not an awful lot. And you know, that sounds quite surprising, you know. Dane, aren't you a fan of German armies? And yes, in fact, that's my fact. I've been more critical of this than I might otherwise have been. Because really, in that regard, it also fails a bit. But, you know, let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'll sort of go into those details, but again, you know, what is the Oberkommando West about? Well, it's a rather particular faction. It's, well, to some extent, in terms of mechanically for the bases, you're actually running a lot on trucks. Specifically, the Schwere Wehrmacht Schlepper Supply half-track, which you can basically place all over the map where you want. You generally don't want to place it straight into your opponent's territory. And there you can basically then turn it into one of your 4 base buildings, well, 3 base buildings besides their quarters. And that rather, of course, lends an already sort of interesting mechanic to it. More specifically, they don't actually provide any resource bonuses on the territory. I mean, it's not like the British trucks at all. What they can do is basically provide a small effect. For example, you have the Mechanized Regiment headquarters, which can provide repairability, so you can create a forward repair station if you want to. You can have it in the base and have the repairs happen there. It can also, for example, like the Mechanized Regiment, have fuel and munitions transfer, an overall neat, interesting ability, although I think for the fuel transfer it needs to be a bit tweaked, because you actually end up with sacrificing half your munitions, and the ability can't even sort of replenish the fuel you spent on the truck within 10 minutes. It's a bit awkward in that direction. But also, for example, you have the battle group headquarters, which also can actually heal your troops and serve as a forward reinforcement point, or again, you could have it here in the base and have it serve sort of a medic bunker in a sense. So in that regard, you know, the Oberkommando West offers some rather interesting base play and some rather interesting ideas. You know, do you want to play risky with the trucks out in the base or on the open, or do you want to sort of back in the base and play safely? And the final truck is basically a large anti-aircraft gun, not an 88 flak though, but still able to cause a bit of harm to aircraft and sort of put a stop to infantry. So in that regard, they do offer some interesting options, a few interesting choices. Another interesting mechanic is that the Sturm Pioneers and the Volksgrenadier, the 2 basic infantry of the Oberkommando, can also salvage for fuel from vehicles, wrecks, abandoned weapons and such. So that, for example, offers there, and that of course is another thing to keep in mind. The Oberkommando West gets less fuel, less munitions than the other armies. They only get 2/3 or 66% out of it. So generally, as the Oberkommando West, you're generally starved for munitions, starved for fuel throughout the fight, and you can't, unlike the other armies, build caches. So again, you're reliant on salvaging, and you're reliant on transfer here from munitions or fuel in that case. And again, I'm not 100% sure this is quite alright. So that is one thing to keep in mind while playing with the Oberkommando West as well. You will be struggling a bit, and then of course in that regard, you know, you're supposed to sort of have more stronger units. For example, all of your units as the Oberkommando West have 5 levels of veterancy. Other armies only 3, but the Oberkommando West has 5. Now this is a bit interesting. It sort of, you know, adds some more punch, and against certain vehicles can certainly give them a bit more punch in the longer run, certainly. And the infantry, it sort of gets a bit weird at the moment. They actually get a bit too tough when they hit veterancy 4, veterancy 5, and that rather create some special situations. Maybe they should shift out some things with more abilities, but overall, I mean, it does mean that it's in longer run, despite being crippled on resource, you can still provide a rather nasty army. On the other hand, of course, it also provides a bit of baggage, since if you then lose any of those veterancy 5 units, it's going to hurt a lot more. So there's a bit sort of a double-edged blade right there, with then a sort of an next nasty little thing then again with the resource starvation. So there are some things there to keep in mind. Also, you can, for example, use your Volksgrenadiers to lay down sandbags, and your Pioneers do have the option of some more than usually impressive barbed wire, which can't actually be cut, and can also hold light vehicles. So in that regard, the Oberkommando also has some fun advantages there. And that sort of, I suppose, overall explains some of the more basic concepts of the Oberkommando West and sort of what they work about. But now we'll be moving on to the infantry, sort of having a bit more of a look at the infantry, how that works, and my thoughts there. So then, let's have a look at some of the starting units here. Also for the Oberkommando West, you have the mighty Sturm Pioneer, essentially a Panzergrenadier squad, sort of in the form of pioneers, equipped with the mighty assault rifles. They have access to, well, my support packages which allow them to clear mines, cut wire, but also actually increases their repair speeds. In that regard, it's actually quite nifty. They are also noticeably more expensive, costing 320 manpower, so they are some quite expensive gentlemen. On the other hand, they can generally sort of win in several engagements. Also ability to lay down shoe meaning, and of course reinforced barbed wire, as we already talked about. And depending on doctrine, they can also gain further abilities. They also get access to medical supplies to Veterans 1 and concussive grenade to Veterans 3, basically a stun grenade, though overall I think I'd prefer having a smoke grenade, something a bit more regular, which could be used a bit more supportive. Overall, interesting unit, not bad, but generally not something you'll be getting a lot of due to their cost, and generally also because they're a bit similar under the same issue that the Panzer is, that is, they can't really project their firepower to certain ranges. Though one thing to note, they're reasonably effective against scout cars, more specifically Soviet scout cars, so that's a little neat little thing to come in mind as well. Also one thing to keep in mind, at least currently, they take ages to veteran job. Usually you'll find them hitting veteran 2, and then basically they don't really move much further than that. So that's a little thing to keep in mind of them as well. But overall, not a bad unit. Sort of reasonably able to lay down firepower and put some pressure on your opponent, if you will, and generally sort of overall handy, though generally not what most players will be going for in the long run, simply because it's not that cost effective. And of course we see another unit here, the Kubelwagen. Yes indeed, there's been a slight Jeep-like vehicle added here to the Germans, the Kubelwagen, equipped with an MG34. It's a bit of a scout vehicle, and it can also, you know, suppress the enemy, and that sounds lovely, except as you might be noticing, the range rather short. Now that's the second problem. It's a Jeep or a Kubelwagen, which also means it's an easy target because it's much bigger than an MG crew, which actually means that even the one it's suppressing, it could still actually end up taking quite a bit of damage, and it's not very thickly armoured. And that already might then be getting people, well, that actually sounds slightly problematic. And then comes the next one, which is, of course, if you lose it, you can't recruit, yet it costs the exact same as another machine gun. So in that regard, it actually has several flaws. It's got 5-level veterancy, but generally you probably won't ever see that happen because, again, with the range and the armor, it's not very survivable. And that, again, is really the main problem, and in the long run, you'll generally just find it wasted. If you want a reliable machine gun, either you sneak one out of the opponent, or you go for the doctrine variant, the MG34, which is overall a lot more useful. And all in here again, we sort of see again the issue with, you know, there's a lot of neat ideas, but again, the units just don't work out. Again, the Kubelwagen, neat idea, but it just doesn't work out. And interestingly enough, it actually talks here about the light transport, and I actually think that would be something the Oberkommando West could actually do with, because it actually hasn't got any. I mean, for something that's supposed to be an elite faction, it's rather lacking in, you know, what most German elite units had, which was a lot of transport. In fact, the more transportation, more specifically half-tracks the German army unit had, the more elite you can usually actually depend on it being. But here we have the Oberkommando West, supposedly very elite, and less mobile than a Panzergrenadier unit. So that is a bit of a point there where sort of things get a bit awkward. But again, overall, I don't really think the Kubelwagen would work very much in the sort of suppressive role, just sort of have mob harasser, give machine gun shots some damage, and maybe an upgrade to have its service as transport. It might actually have been a lot more useful. So that sort of is a bit unfortunate right there, but you know, enough about that. Let's sort of move on to the next bit of unit available. And then we finally have the Volksgrenadier, the basic infantry, the core infantry of the Oberkommando West, and also the one I really have a lot of issue with. And you might be asking, why is that, Dane? Why do you have such issue with the Volksgrenadiers? Well, the issue rather comes down on several points, not just one point, but really sort of an issue with the Volksgrenadier. The issue is sort of, essentially, they cost the same as every other infantry unit. There's 240 manpower, the same as conscripts, the same as grenadiers, yet overall they don't really do as much damage as them. They also, in compared to either, they either have maybe a bit more health than the grenadiers, but I'm not in comparison to the conscripts who actually, through 6 members, already have more health already. So already there's a bit sort of an awkward spot there for the Volksgrenadiers. They're not really that effective on their own already, as I'm sure some of you then can sort of slightly figure out. But then of course there are other things. I mean, in terms of upgrades, you'd think, you know, again, this again, the elite faction, and they only have a Panzerschreck, which sort of sounds nice, but again costs 90 munitions, and remember, munitions are rather hard-earned resource to the Oberkommando, so already there has a few slight issues. They got grenades, but still also expensive. And of course then sort of already there sort of ends up being divisive. Do I get a Panzerschreck, or do I actually want to deal with infantry? And the Volksgrenadiers then also remains another problem. Sort of you can get them quickly off in that veterancy. They become sort of reasonably good, perhaps even too good with a Panzerschreck. Again, at veterancy 5, again, that slight oddity here with the veterancy being perhaps a bit too effective at the moment of veterancy 5, but still. Then sort of another issue hits, and that is, you know, and that was basically the problem with the initial assault gunners to a certain extent was, you know, after a certain point, there's no point in calling them because they won't do you much good because they are simply not very effective in the long run. Again, if they don't hit a certain level of veterancy, they're basically just a waste of space and air and manpower. And they're actually more of a drain to you than an aid because they can't do a lot. And that's really also the main issue, and then being particularly then consider where the main army is, you know. It's an army that is very reliant on having few units in terms of vehicle. It needs, you know, a flexible core infantry. And it's not, I'm not saying, you know, it should be as flexible as they are because they just pick up whatever equipment, but the Volksgrenadier are surprisingly inflexible. They are surprisingly rubbish. They really can do very little in the long run. They have practically no worthwhile upgrades, except the Panzerschreck, and even that, you know, can be questionable in the longer run. And then you sort of begin to wonder, well, what's the purpose of them? Again, most players will essentially trade them out with other units. Doctrine infantry, or the higher tier Ober-soldaten, which are a special case I'll get into as well, because, as you might guess, yes, that's a very silly name. But really, they need more. They need more than they currently have. They need some kind of more upgrades, because that's also the personal issue I have with them. They have nothing to do with their namesakes. They have nothing to do with actual Volksgrenadiers. You might say, how is that possible, Dane? They're weak infantry. But here's the thing. Volksgrenadiers were known for basically having a higher quantity of automatic weaponry. That is, assault rifles or machine guns. And what do these gentlemen not have? Assault rifles or machine guns. Do you sort of see the issue? They are the most removed from actual Volksgrenadiers of all the infantry in the game. Conscripts with submachine guns are closer to actual Volksgrenadiers. Grenadiers with machine guns are closer to Volksgrenadiers. Panzergrenadiers, Sturm Pioneers, American infantry. Hell, Osttruppen called in with Osttruppen reserves are closer to actual Volksgrenadiers than Volksgrenadiers. That's really one of my personal major issues. Again, I know this is as a history buff, as a nerd, and of course I won't expect to be fully, you know, accountable in that direction because, you know, they can all discuss all this with Steam, and then still, they even mention, you know, in bulletins and such, but still, not a single automatic weapon for the Volksgrenadiers. Again, they have naught to do with Volksgrenadiers. And again, is also essentially their issue in the longer run. Again, there is nothing to keep them going, nothing to help them get in fight. You have to replace them. They are terrible infantry. They need upgrades. They need at least a light machine gun and MG34 as an upgrade, and even need to upgrade would also say be an assault rifle, which they could sort of, you know, do as a single shot, maybe with a burst ability, but still they need more. And again, that's really one of the core issues of the Oberkommando West. They have terrible core infantry, which won't really last long in the longer run. Alongside stuff like the Kubelwagen, and you can see again, and there's actually a lot of units which don't really fully work even within sort of, you know, the function of the army they're placed within, in particular, in fact, within the army they're stuck within. And that's really, again, sort of one of the major issues. But let's sort of move on to the final unit, the Ober-soldat. And then, of course, you have the Ober-soldaten, one of the meanest infantry squads in the entire game. A 4-man squad equipped with an MG34. And also the ones that can actually fire it on the moon, which rather makes them rather impressive that it can actually fire a machine gun like that. Have some rather interesting abilities. Also, a certain doctrine that can be upgraded with some infrared Sturmgewehrs, bun grenades, and some other fun abilities, including some Blenker for smoke grenades. I think it's a bit too expensive for a smoke grenade, even if it damages. Booby traps and whatnot. A rather unique unit, a rather nice uniform as well. And again, that's also one thing I actually have to comment on. really great uniforms on the Oberkommando West, really good German uniforms compared to, say, the Ostheer or Wehrmacht, you know, which in some cases look a bit silly. We get great cuts for the Volksgrenadiers in winter. We got some nice camouflage uniforms, so on. Some really, you know, something you wanted to comment on again. Great uniforms, absolutely grand, love it. But again, the Ober-soldaten, and you know, the name Ober-soldaten, over-soldier, silly. They should have gone either for Stormtroopers or Sturmgrenadiers, and they were actually a division of Sturmgrenadiers, and something like that might have worked better. But overall, not a bad unit. Powerful though, again, if you get enough veterans, it's going to be too powerful for the opponent, but still, a little sort of thing to keep in mind. They are basically Knights Cross holders times 2 for those that played the first game, and they're actually a lot more interesting, I think, than the Knights Cross holders. Also, fun thing, they probably sort of more reflect actual Panzer Grenadiers than the Wehrmacht Panzer, since they actually have a light machine gun, and that was sort of more what Panzer actually had off. So, a little thing there to keep in mind when utilising the Ober-soldaten. Of course, also something to keep in mind there with while playing the Oberkommando West. They are overall quite grand, though. Again, it's not uncommon to see players rather rely on Fallschirmjäger or other doctrinal elite infantry. But sort of again, a little quick note again. Terrible name, but otherwise good unit, fun unit, and such. Just wish the smoke grenade was a bit more evenly priced. So, like that, and of course we'll now be moving on to the vehicle, to the armor, to the flak panzers, and what not else. Now then, looking at vehicles, of course, the Oberkommando has sort of a nice and interesting mix of things. Of course, they have the good old Panzerkampfwagen 5, the Panzer. Even more impressive here, of course, for the 5 level of veterans. Yeah, at that rate, you know, if you can get it there, it certainly becomes quite the potent opponent. Of course, I mean, you won't generally be spamming them, though, as the Oberkommandos, because, again, the fuel costs and fuel sort of income you have and economy you have, of course, will leave you with a lot less resources of armor. And of course, that in combination with the other vehicles really creates a bit of a problem. You might be asking, you know, well, why did you actually start talking about the Panther first? Because, well, here's the thing. The Panther is currently the most viable, the most, you know, useful unit the Oberkommando has. Most units utterly fail in comparison. That's not to say all of it does. I mean, we, for example, take a look at the flak half-tag over here, the another unit that sort of works reasonably well. Not too expensive, available from the next class regiment, and can genuinely sort of put a nice threat to enemy infantry, and even light vehicles. Also has access to smoke and veterans. One sort of neat, though also very weak, can sort of be knocked out quickly if you're not careful. It's not something you will use like a scout car or an armoured car or anything like that, but overall, well positioned, is actually quite a nasty heavy weapon, and can even work against aircraft. It's one of them. From here, for example, you have the light Infanteriegeschütz, and of course you have from here Panther, Ober-soldaten. Maybe the Panzer II looks, but then that's already there. You'll expend a lot of resource towards logistics, and then of course you might say get that one again, get the Panther. No, again, you'll get more at the Panther because the Panther can deal with armory infantry, and again, that's the problem. The Oberkommando West has too many specialists. More specifically, for example, looking, oh, the half-track sort of works from vehicles, infantry, sort of nice round base, but then you get the Puma, which of course, as we've already seen with the Ostheer, or Wehrmacht, what it's getting called, only really works well. This vehicle, again, as we've sort of seen, you know, with the Ostheer, it's, you know, not worth much because it can't really deal with infantry. Sure, you have the impressive Stuka zu Fuß, but that's rather expensive, and that's artillery, and you usually will get something before getting the artillery. And most recommendably, that's not going to be a Puma. You have to say, oh, the infrared. Well, why would you ever get that? And that's sort of really one of the issues. You have an infrared searchlight, which sounds really cool. You can sort of look through the scut fog of war and such. But yeah, the really question becomes, well, but does it actually do something for me? And that's really where you basically said, well, you know, I could use this, or I could just send some infantry and save the fuel up for something a bit more worthwhile. And again, that's sort of the problem. There's a lot of these sort of highly over-specialized units. You get the Jagdpanzer 470, the tank destroyer, but rather suffers when you rather begin comparing it parts to other tank destroyers. You want to say, well, what's the problem? Well, say compare it to the American Jackson tank destroyer. It has about the same range, lacks a turret, does less damage, in fact, and is less mobile. Sure, it has more health and more armor, but in most cases, for example, versus Jackson, it won't do it much. And the low mobility certainly won't do much against most other armor. In particular, versus a Soviet player, it's just going to get swarmed. And then all of a sudden, you sort of begin to see, oh. At the same time, it lacks the penetration to deal with heavier armor. And then you go, oh. And then you sort of begin seeing where the Jagdpanzer 470 runs into a problem, in particular, since it's absolutely terrible versus infantry on top of that. And then you go, oh. You'd have been better off with a Stug or Sturmgeschütz. Yes, you would have. Because, you know, the Stug ends up being a lot more viable. If you ask me to get a Stug or a Jagdpanzer IV, I'd prefer the Stug. Cheaper, has overall more effect, and also more effective against armor, in a sense, because it's more maneuverable, has a higher rate of fire, and also has target weak point, whereas this one can make itself invisible, which can be neat and a bit useful, but, you know, I'd rather prefer finishing off my opponent's armor than hiding from it. But also, say, compared to the H-35, more expensive as well than an H-35. It doesn't have any ability to allow to see further, actually taking full advantage of its range. And of course then you also have to count in the fuel costs of it, and of course again the lower fuel, and overall again, unlike the Soviet, you can't really tailor your forces, sort of again, you really have sort of a bit more broad edge to sort of cover things up in front of it. So in that department it also ends up suffering a bit, and of course unlike the Soviets, you can't just quickly build up another, which again, due to the Soviet being cheaper and the Soviet economy being less, you know, in the trash, again, the Jagdpanzer IV simply ends up not being worth it. For the Jagdpanzer IV to be worth it, I would always suggest, you know, make it into a bit of an assault gun, maybe give it a at least switch between high explosive and armor piercing gun, but something so it actually hurts infantry, or replace it with its more normal cost than just the Jagdpanzer IV with a more regular gun, or a Hetzer. Because currently, again, it's just basically the Elephant made smaller, and the Elephant is junk on treads. And sort of, let's just, while we're there in junky units, we also got the Jagd Tiger, which sounds really impressive, except, you know, it suffers pretty much the exact same issues as the Elephant, which is, you know, great versus tanks, except it can't hit them, shoot slowly, turn slowly, move slowly, sees poorly. The Jagd Tiger can shoot through houses and such, which is impressive, but again, it just fails, and it's the most expensive unit in the game. It makes no sense. I mean, again, compared to an ISU-152, it utterly fails, because overall, an ISU will still have more impact versus infantry versus armor, the Jagd Tiger not. So again, there's already, again, that sense of lots of specialists, lots of Wunderwaffen, but no actual Waffen. And of course, we have the Sturm Tiger, which itself is also a unique piece of trash. Great against, you know, hitting stuff, it can actually stay there, and certainly that's nice and neat, and so it has a nice novelty effect. But on the longer run, you know, how many people do you see, for example, using the Sturmpanzer IV? Because the Sturm Tiger is just a bigger version of it. And then you already have a bit of your answer there. Not a lot of people. And then you find you sort of have, you know, the Piece de Resistance, the Königstiger, and that of course is really fun. I mean, that's powerful, strong, all around, and also bloody expensive. Now, I'm not saying this should necessarily make it cheaper or anything like that, but it's a good thing to keep in mind, particularly when your only real recourse is aiming for the Panther. That's really going to put a King Tiger rather far out there, and in particular also again when the trade resource mechanic is not necessarily very effective either. So overall, you in most cases not exactly see a King Tiger either. In particular because also your infantry isn't really flexible and sort of. And again, that's really the issue with the Oberkommando West. A lot of the core units it has doesn't work, or doesn't work very well. There are too many specialists that don't do much. And as long as that happens, the Oberkommando will be limited in what it can do. And overall, again, the current real strategies will pays off is get some infantry, quickly replace that with doctrine infantry or Ober-soldaten. Fallschirmjägers being popular at the moment, in particular once they hit some higher level threat infantry, they're absolutely mean. Get some Panthers and basically take it from there, because again, nothing else in the long run is worth it except the Panther. So again, that is very much important to keep in mind. And again, that is very much the primary issue with the Oberkommando West. It's sort of a bit of a repeat of the Panzerelite, except the Panzerelite had sort of more units that actually worked. It had half tracks, it sort of had more variety of infantry, and had a slightly better economy. Though of course those units still use it, but here it's just sort of more specialists that won't see usage, and even fewer units are actually worth it. So in that regard, I just fear that in the long run, the Oberkommando West won't be very interesting to play with, because you're facing against it, see a lot of the same strategies repeated ad nauseum, and with it you'll generally won't find yourself with a lot of options, because a lot of the units you have are basically rubbish. And that rather sort of points it out for me why I just don't really think the Oberkommando is fully worth it. It's not fully bad. It's not like, you know, the Oberkommando is broken beyond repair, and whoever was behind it must be shot and hung from a lamppost. No, it's not like that. I mean, you know, if you describe it, it's an army with full of potential, lots of good ideas, but it just fails to get there. It's sort of like a prototype Tiger or Panther. Lots of kinks, issues, the engine bursts into flames if it turns into a certain angle, guns lock up, optics not fully prepared, mechanics jam, freeze, or whatever, all burst into flame. But you know there's a good tank in there somewhere eventually if you sort of get it fixed, and that's the same thing with the Oberkommando. There's a lot of kinks, there's a lot of issues, there are sort of mechanical things that need to be sorted out, but in the end, there's a good army waiting there, but it needs to be sorted out. The infantry needs to be looked at again, Volksgrenadiers need an overhaul, and certain parts of the Oberkommando West vehicle pool needs an overhaul again. Puma needs to be bloody worthwhile versus infantry. Jagdpanzer, the same. And they need to replace this with an actual half-track which could actually be of use to the Oberkommando West, say an open-topped half-track instead of the one with cloth covering it. And then they might also want to look into sort of changing up some of the veterans abilities available to the Oberkommando in sort of the higher levels, at least for the infantry. If they did that, I'm pretty sure the Oberkommando West would be just as fun, because I mean, if you compare to the Americans, the Oberkommando just sort of seem, the Americans just sort of brimming with excitement, potential, and they actually sort of reach it. The Oberkommando West, not quite there, and that sort of makes it even more sad. You could just look at the Americans and see, wow, that's great, and then you look at the Oberkommando and looks, wow, that has the potential to be great, but a lot of it isn't really. And also in terms of fulfilling historical potential, the Americans pull it off a lot better, whereas the Oberkommando is sort of like, well, the Volksgrenadiers are not really Volksgrenadiers, and overall, a lot of it doesn't just really work. So it gets kind of problematic in that regard. But again, if it gets fixed, I could much more easily recommend it. It's not to say, don't get this army or don't play this army at all, but, be aware there will be problems, there will be hiccups, there will be units that basically don't work, and you probably shouldn't bother with until they are fixed, and you'll probably lose more than you win with them in the long run as well, unless again you stick to a very specific strategy, which again might get things a bit dull. So, proceed with caution. Don't just rush into it and get it. And that's not to say completely stay away from it like it's coated in something really foul smelling, but just be aware you are going to move into something that is in need of more work, of some fine tuning, some fixing, some brushing up here and there before it's fully workable like a well-maintained Tiger tank. Because again, there's a lot of fun to be had with it occasionally, but there's also a lot of, swearing and other fun things, or less fun things in them, because again, a lot of it is not fully workable. So again, keep that very much in mind while playing it and while playing against it. This is Imperial Dane saying cheers. Hope you enjoyed this little review. Hope you learned something from it. Hope it might have given you some thoughts on the Oberkommando West. And cheers.